when the First World War hit, we don't have a lot. I haven't managed to find a lot in our collection that relates to Sandown and Hurst Park in the war years, probably because, you know, racing isn't going on, I don't think, and they're being used. How did the First World War affect Sandown and Hurst Park exactly in comparison to other racecourses across the country?
All racecourses got used for other things, apart from a very small number where there was a little bit of racing maintained during the war. The First World War probably affected things at home less, but racecourses did provide a place both for troops to be stationed, prisoner of war camps, transport depots and so forth. And Sandown Park throughout the Second World War was used by the United States Air Force as a station, or Sandown rather I should say, was used as a Guards Division depot, and Hurst Park was used for the USA Air Force as well as a mobilisation area for the Territorial Army. And Hurst Park held its last meeting in May 1915, which was about 9 months after the war started, and then reopened in May 1919. Sandown followed a similar pattern, and they did open a little bit earlier in 1918, just before the war finished. The Second World War probably had a more devastating effect, and Sandown didn't reopen until well into 1946, mainly because of the needing to repair and so forth, damage to the course and to the buildings that have been caused by its occupation by the military.
I thought that somewhere I read about vegetables and things being grown there and the land being used for the land army's kind of efforts as well. Is that true?
It's certainly true that racecourses were used for vegetables and so forth, and planting of crops. I think it's probably not Sandown and Kempton in that instance, or Sandown and Hurst Park in that instance. It's some of the courses more out in the rural areas where you see them being used for agriculture.
Was war a massive detriment to both of the race courses, or was it kind of just a pause in their activity? Did they find it easy to pick up afterwards?
Compared to some, yes. The dates that I sort of quoted earlier about the closing and the first meetings after the war suggest they didn't have a huge amount of war damage to put right. There are certainly other courses who found it much harder to get going. One of the worst being Newbury, which had been used throughout the war. Again, Newbury is a course that's right by the side of the railway, and it was used throughout the war as a railway marshalling yard for munitions. And so when the war ended, the whole course had been covered by several miles of railway sidings, which all had to be removed, and of course then the grass resown and everything else. So that, I don't think Newbury reopened until the early 1950s. It took quite some time to get it all back to standard.
Yeah, okay. And in terms of audience appetite for racing, was that just as much after the war? Did it go back to kind of normal levels?
I think initially even went higher than normal levels, in that, you know, after not having, I mean, there was a little bit of racing during the Second World War, but it was very, very limited. And of course, most people could only go on a very infrequent basis because they had other things they had to do. The immediate period after the war, there was the euphoria of, you know, war's over, we just had VE Day as I'm recording this, you know, and everybody wanted to get out, they wanted to go to things. And the Whitsun Monday meeting at Hurst Park, or Easter Monday meeting, I should say, which actually took over from Kempton because Kempton wasn't quite ready, had an attendance in 1946 of 49,000.
Wow.
So the huge crowd, when you think of, most of those would have come by public transport and by less cars in those days.
Yeah, huge. That's amazing. Thank you. There were lots of mentions of straw or grass covering the roads on race days from people who remember Hurst Park. And I just wondered why that was necessary.
Yeah, I mean, there were two main crossings at Hurst Park where the races went across a public road. The first one was in Greyburn Way, which is still probably familiar to people today as you go down towards Molesey Cricket Club. And the races over 6 and 7 furlongs used to start on the Hampton Court side of that road. And so when they crossed it, it was covered with a deep bed of peat and then covered with grass cuttings. I think the grass cuttings basically meant that when they raced from the grass either side, the horses didn't notice they were going across something a bit different. The other crossing was at the other end of the course, across what is now Ferry Road, and that I don't think was always covered in quite the same way. It had a peat covering, but the horses, by the time they got to Ferry Road, they'd already got past the winning post, and so they were slowing down and pulling up. But they did go across, if they were going very fast, into the area which is where some houses have now been built, and of course is where Cobham Free School is now. But basically, when they first opened the course, they only had sufficient land to have a round course or an oval course, which meant that the racing authorities would only let them have jump racing, because on the flat where the horses do go much faster over sprint distances, they don't like them racing round bends, and that's one of the reasons why Hurst Park went and bought an extra piece of land going down across Greyburn Way so they could race over 6 and 7 furlongs.
Moving on to the kind of audiences of racecourses, I read a lot about the differences in the ways that men and women were treated at each of these clubs, and that women only had particular abilities to train and things like that in the later stages in the jockey club. When did men and women become totally equal at both racecourses, and what were the differences before that in the way that they were treated?
Well, I referred briefly earlier to the fact that the actual club enclosure at Hurst Park and Sandown, both of them were the same, had a men's only membership, but women could be invited in by the members. As far as racehorse training is concerned and racehorse ownership, there were some very wealthy women who had racehorses, but they used to run them under pseudonyms. And one of the well-known ones that would be familiar to people is Lily Langtry, who was a favourite of Prince Edward before he became King Edward VII. That's it, yeah, Edward VII. And she raced her name, she was nicknamed, of course, by the press, the Jersey Lily, and she used to race her horses under the name of Mr. Jersey. So it sounded as though it was a man, not a woman, who owned them, but of course it was. And there were several other examples like that. The issue about trainers holding licenses became much more protracted, and it wasn't until the 1960s, in fact 4 years after Hurst Park closed, that a woman in Sussex called Florence Nagel, who had trained horses for many years, decided to take the Jockey Club to court, and eventually got a ruling in the Court of Appeal that basically said women should train racehorses in their own right. And up until then, Mrs. Nagel had to have her licence to train held by her head lad, which of course is nonsense, because the trainer is responsible, but the head lad, who was just an employee of the yard, had to have his name on the licence. So it was a real subterfuge to get around the rules.
That's really interesting, thank you. It is fascinating when you talk about pseudonyms and the different ways in which people found loopholes to get around all of this. Was it something that people in general knew that women were still getting training and taking part in these things just through the loopholes? Did people know about that?
Oh yeah.
So it was basically just a legal thing.
No, it was a male supremacy thing of the Jockey Club, who didn't want to have women training horses, but their arguments as to why they were unsuitable to do so was fairly flimsy, and that's one of the reasons why the Court of Appeal ruled against them. Interestingly, Mrs. Nagel, having won her case against the Jockey Club, turned her attention to the dog breeding organisations, and had and turned against them, and got them because they wouldn't recognise women owners and breeders again in the Kennel Club. So she was certainly a pioneer, if you like, to actually take women forward in racing. And of course, it wasn't long after the, relatively speaking, that the Jockey Club then allowed women to ride in the middle of the 1970s, and most of that was down to the Equal Opportunities Acts and so forth.
Great. And what were some of those reasons that were given beforehand as to why women couldn't race?
I was obviously only on the fringes of that. I think some of it was, I think as far as women jockeys are concerned, there may have been concerns about injury and so forth, which perhaps some people felt was, worse for a woman than a man. As far as women trainers were concerned, I think they thought there might be some skullduggery, but quite how they worked that one out, I don't know.
Great, thank you. In general, would you say that either Sandown or Hurst Park, one was more socially exclusive than the other? Did that change over time? Were they pretty equal in terms of their audiences? And
I think they were very similar. People who went racing at whatever level, in terms of society, would have gone to Sandown and Kempton, and the other courses from London. London was a very big population, so if you were interested in racing, it was easy to get to Sandown, it was easy to get to Hurst Park, and so forth. So I don't think they were that different, and in fact Sandown continued their exclusivity of their enclosure through until the late 1960s, early 1970s, whereas Hurst Park had started to relax theirs not long before it closed.
Great, thank you. And this is kind of linked to the stuff that we've just been talking about women, men, etc. But in your opinion, why were racecourses in general becoming such a target for suffragette violence? In 1913, you see the attack on Hurst Park by Kitty Marion, and obviously the Emily Davidson attack. Why was that, such a common thing?
I think it probably ties in with what everyone sort of understands about the suffragette movement, in the racecourses were seen as a bit of a bastion of the upper classes, the exclusivity of their members' enclosures, and if you get race cards from, as you probably have got for Hurst Park and so forth, for the early part of the 20th century, most of the stewards and so forth were either nobility or they were ex-army. And so it was very much a sort of a class thing, and I think they were seen as very much the enemy as far as the suffragettes were concerned.
Thank you.